So we are filming now, and this is our reprieve from last week, where we were kind of close to getting it together, but I didn't have it together. So now I think I got it together.
Fresh start.
Fresh start. As I was telling you then, that I'm doing this curatorial fellowship for A Blade of Grass, and as the fellow, my job is to curate a grant, and it's their first grant to individual artists. And the artists are based in New York City and have what we're calling a socially engaged practice, and we can kind of get into what your ideas are about that, what my ideas are about that in this process, as we kind of work through the interview. But in addition to social engagement, part of the curating the grant process is about having opening up the process to some sort of public discourse, which is where the filming comes in, because these will eventually end up as small webisodes on the organization's website. And then ultimately, at the end of the process, there will be 4 artists will be awarded $10,000 grants, and then there'll be some sort of public platform program event that comes out of these awards. So a part of this process is really thinking through ideas in contemporary art that are taking place beyond gallery spaces, and really thinking about how artists are working with audiences in that way. And in addition, then how philanthropy and curatorial work have to kind of mold themselves to be able to embrace this type of artistic practice. Mm-hmm. So if you can just start by giving a background, first your name, who you are, why you're in New York City, and then talk about the work that you're doing as it relates to social engagement.
Okay. My name is Shane Aslan Selzer. I'm an artist living in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and I've been living here almost 7 years. Mm-hmm. Before that, I was in San Francisco. The reason that I moved to New York had a lot to do with arts community, mm-hmm. and wanting to be around a peer network and develop a peer network that really pushed the kind of conversations that I was having with regards to my research and my practice.
And are these conversations, not to cut you off, but just since you said, are these conversations that you started having in San Francisco while you were in graduate school?
These are conversations I've been looking to have and attempting to have, and sometimes successfully having, my whole life. Mm-hmm. And I think most of my educational path and travel path throughout my life has been based on a kind of search for really key conversations that are important to me. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, for me, has been about artist-to-artist conversations. A big part of my practice, I've realized in recent years, I think I've articulated more and more, is that a conversation between artists and the responsibility that artists have to each other is really important to me. And it's really key for how I process information, how I read images, how I understand work, and that without it, I feel like art sort of, it gets stilled, it's in the vacuum, and I'm not very interested in it. So New York, the idea that New York has a lot of hustle, has a lot of opportunity, but it also just has a lot of really hardworking people who are working artists, and that's kind of always how I've seen myself, as a working artist. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in a really positive way, just as like a regular working person that's an artist. What I admire about artists is the ability to forge your own path and to sort of use creative problem solving to figure out what that path is in a variety of ways, drawing on a really diverse range of skill sets. And I think that there's this kind of unfortunate thing happening in the art world and by that I mean the kind of market-driven art world, where things are really based on selection, granting, awarding, honoring, getting picked, and it takes away the agency. That's what I'm most drawn to about being an artist in the first place, which is the kind of like, do it yourself, get up, make the conversation happen, make the work happen, get it out there any way that you need to, without a kind of waiting to be told. So I think that's kind of a core of social engagement for me, is that attitude. And I think that attitude started for me, and awareness about it started in Chicago, which is a great sort of do-it-yourself city.
It's a great working city.
And it's where I lived directly after undergrad and interned at an arts magazine, the New Art Examiner. And during that time I worked on a zine series where a group of artists, we would go to all the openings on Friday night, and then we would write really subjective kind of ranting reviews about them, often like battling multiple voices, and then we'd turn it around, print it as a leaflet handout, and distribute them to all the galleries Saturday morning, so that there was this like immediate turnover conversation happening.
Yeah.
And I don't think it was the best art criticism, and there was like a lot to be said of good and bad about what we were doing, but it was like this first time I was part of this energy about having a conversation about work, and it taught me so much about artwork and what's the agency of objects in a room and how they affect people and how people affect each other, and that really got me to start thinking about hybrid practices and not kind of picking a discipline.
You say a few things that I think we could pick up on and really build as a part of this. For me, the first couple of things is you say that a large part of your work is, at least in the beginning, is about having conversations with artists, right? So there's this artist to artist or community of artists that are sitting around, they're talking, they're kind of sharing ideas, whether it be criticism or just kind of the experience of being in a room with objects and trying to attach some sort of language to it. But then there's also the element of the community, right? The community that you need, that isn't necessarily the arts community, but the space where the worker is, where people who get up every day, who go to work, and that toil, and just the sort of, the artfulness in that, in that labor. And maybe we can talk about what the artfulness would be in relation to that. But how then do you make the connection between the conversations that are taking place with artists and among artists, and then the community in which you're living and making and gaining a lot of energy from? How does that conversation then get returned back to the place from which it is generated, and then that kind of cycle, to allow that kind of cycle to be fruitful?
I think I can talk it through best by talking through some projects. So I think a really clean-cut example is the saddle fitting clinics that I've done and am planning to continue to do. And I grew up around horses, and I'm really interested in the saddle as a specialized, highly crafted object that allows language to pass through it between a horse and a rider. So it's not only this sort of beautifully articulated abstract object, but it's also a really utilitarian language tool. And I felt like I wanted to have a conversation. I was asked to be a part of a show in rural Wisconsin, and I wanted to have a conversation between the arts community and a kind of local community. And these words community, I want to talk more about that because it's confusing to me.
Yes.
And I think it's problematic, right? Like, I don't think I'm separate from the community.
Right.
Right? Like, I think I am like the toiling person who gets up and works odd jobs and goes on the subway and has bills to pay and all that stuff, right?
See, that's the great thing about it, you know, that being, as an artist, a part still of the machine, the overarching machine, right? So all these terms are to be thrown out there and like smashed open. Community, social engagement, you know, all these, you know, kind of terms that are limited ability to speak about particular things really sets up these kind of, you know, borders and boundaries. But
I do think that I have some critical skill sets as an artist that allows me to navigate the machine to my benefit.
Yes.
And I manipulate that at every chance I can get. So with the saddle fitting clinics, what I decided to do was to use horses, use the saddle itself as this language tool to connect two disparate groups of people, to have a conversation about abstraction and about sculpture ultimately, which is really, I'm really interested in the kind of social impact of abstraction and how objects, not only how we affect objects, but how objects affect us in our daily life in a really profound and social way. So I invited a master saddle fitter who's someone who's trained both as a rider, also trained by a saddle maker to understand how a saddle's made to fit a horse, how it's made to fit a rider. The master saddle fitter can tweak a saddle, they can pull wool out, they can add padding in certain areas. They know how to manipulate it to make it have the most close contact fit for both parties. And they also have a wealth of knowledge about every part of the saddle, every kind of saddle, etc. So the saddle fitter came, and I made an announcement, a kind of handmade drawing that announced it in the local paper, that there would be this saddle fitting clinic. I asked people to bring horses as demonstration. We had about 6 people bring horses, and we did it on the front lawn out in front of the Arts Center. And the audience was really mixed. There were horse people that came from Minnesota for it because they were excited about this saddle fitter. There were art people that came from Chicago for it because they were part of the Art Institute, you know, Chicago art world. And then the saddle fitter gave a demonstration and used the horses to demonstrate it and to really talk through the saddle as this highly crafted object. And it was this way that she gave common language so that everyone there then could have a conversation about these saddles. And we had about 35 saddles displayed on sawhorses on the lawn that people could peruse and touch and be up close with and talk about. And some of them were in different states of deconstruction, so you could really see the tree of a saddle, you could see the structure, you could see the form, and you could really understand its making. And I think that was a really successful moment for me because I felt like I was learning things from people who were there, who were participating, from all sides of it. From other artists, from horse people, from a blacksmith who had a lot to add about how shoeing the horse's feet affects how the saddle will fit it. It just became a really holistic moment, which to me is so interesting when everything starts to connect.
Yes.
I think the other example would be the Global Crit Clinic. And the Global Crit Clinic is an artist-to-artist project that Kianga Ford and I started last summer in 2011. And it started through conversations that Kianga had with B.C. Silva, who runs the Center for Contemporary Art in Lagos, Nigeria. And they met at the Creative Time conference and started to have these conversations that Kianga and I continued about, you know, as we were traveling, and both Kianga and I have done extensive residencies in various parts of Africa, feeling like artists, through the process of decolonization, don't have a formed sense of agency. And
in what capacity?
In terms of critique culture, in terms of being able to really articulate and push a context and a trajectory for your own work. And I see increasingly a lot of opportunities for African artists in the international art world, but most of them are kind of these curator pluck opportunities. So the context is sort of given over to someone else. You don't have a lot of artist-curated projects going on the continent. There are some, it's starting to happen, but there is this kind of prevailing attitude of that separation of discipline between artist, critic, curator. And the idea of like, I make the work, you write about the work, you select the work. So how do you start to form a critical language for your own work that comes from your context?
Yes.
So you don't repeat a kind of colonial cycle,
right,
of forcing a context onto otherness, right?
Right.
So we decided to start a clinic, and the clinic started, the pilot clinic was in Lagos, and we thought that West Africa was a good place to start the clinics because of that history of colonization, and because during the process, during the last 40 years of decolonization, there's been so much of like an arrested activity in academia that a lot of things are stunted at the academic level.
Yeah.
There's a kind of like old world European method of training. And it's outmoded in terms of a contemporary way of thinking about your practice as a research practice and what are the methodologies of research that you employ, be them material, social, etc. So the first pilot ran in Lagos, and it's really, it uses heavily the studio critique model as a pedagogical tool.
Yes.
And so it functions off of a kind of fine arts education model where it's looking at direct work and understanding how to make direct observations and start to break down materials and ideas and the connection between them. And then starting to build it back up again from who are the artists that surround your practice, that you can kind of arm yourself with, what's the historical trajectory that you're interested in, that you're looking at, that you want to research further. How do you kind of, it's like, how do you couch your practice so that you can put it out into the world in the way that you want it to go out into the world. I think like the clinics are so interesting to me, and this summer the clinics ran again in Lagos as part of a larger residency program.
The first one was in 2010 or
the
2011.
first one was in 2011.
Okay.
And then from that, we did two things that sort of bookended the clinic, two panels. And the first was a panel of local artists, critics and curators, and Kianga and I were just observers in the audience. The last panel at the end of the clinic involved Kianga and I as well as local artists. And that was focused on a connection between materials and ideas, and how that marriage functions both in difficult and harmonious ways. And from that discussion, there was a lot of energy generated, and this idea that we want the clinics to be self-sustainable, so that it's not about us going somewhere. It's about creating a peer network that then can keep itself going.
Yes. And have you found or developed a way to measure the impact of that?
I think through alumni. We're really closely in touch with alumni, and the alumni are really heavily involved in future clinics. So what happened last summer was that one of the Ghanaian artists that came for the Lagos clinic wanted us to host a clinic in Accra to help her get this going in her community where she runs the Foundation for Contemporary Art. So that kind of getting that off the ground, now they have a crit group going there that she kind of is like reporting back on how does she keep it going, keep that energy and momentum going. We kind of affectionately have been talking about it as like a 10-day MFA, in the sense that all the curricular components that you get in an MFA program get introduced in a really like thrown at you intensive way in that 10 days. And we're doing like 10-hour days for 10 days straight. It's really intense, and people are, it's such that energy of like artists just wanting something so badly and being in it with each other and it clicking that you can just go all day. And I think that it's one of the most exciting things to me about it has been seeing the kind of like leaps and bounds that past participants have made in the past year with their practice, with the way that I see press releases talking about their work, with different kinds of like studio crit groups that people have organized, panel discussions, like all the kind of modular components that get introduced in the clinic then have gotten carried on and taken off in different ways. And for me, it's extending my network in a huge way. I mean, I'm now collaborating with a Ghanaian artist where we write letters back and forth to each other about materials that we're researching and exploring and bringing our own cultural context to those materials. And I have no idea what or if an end product will be of that collaboration, but I totally trust that like the conversations we're having are really important to both of us.
Well, that's kind of exactly where I wanted to go, is to hear more about how the experience of setting up the Global Crit Clinic has informed your life here, your home base here, the institution that it's connected to, because it's connected to Parsons New School, right? So yeah, I want to hear more about the reciprocity effect, like, you know, how does it inform what's happening back in the home base for you, and also what you're critiquing in terms of, you know, what is it that you feel like the structure, the organization, the institution that you're working out of, what it's lacking for even the need for something like this. You know, what is it, how is it informing what the limitations of the institution are, and in which ways it needs to evolve?
I think that working with the Global Crit Clinic is making me two things. It's making me a better teacher, because it's really about tangible skill building, and a lot of times things can get really wishy-washy and in a gray area when you're teaching art at a college level. And I teach part-time at Parsons. I also teach sometimes at Tyler School of Art in Philly. But as an adjunct, you have complete control over your class, but you don't have complete control. You have very little control over the program. And with the Global Crit Clinic, things get very clear. There's a demand, there's a stated demand for things, and then there's a response. And because it is happening in very real time, it has to have this built-in flexibility. And I think it's something that I've learned through my sculpture practice, and I've tried to bring to my everyday life, is this kind of site-responsive attitude, where you can't take your syllabus somewhere and put it down and say it's fixed, the schedule's done. You have to get to know what each person's needs are and how each person is going to learn from you, and then try to go to them on those terms, while still being as acutely aware as possible of your own subjectivity and your own baggage and perspective, not in a negative way, but just in an owning it way.
Right.
So that you can be aware of it.
An awareness, absolutely.
I think that Parsons gave the Global Crit Clinic some initial seed money for the first year, but hasn't been greatly involved in the program. And I struggle with, does the Global Crit Clinic need an academic affiliation?
Right.
I hope that to some extent, it can pull from a multitude of institutional affiliations so that it can more depend on a network of resources than a singular entity.
So it can model itself after the model that it is
Yes.
perpetuating and putting
Yes.
out into the world.
And one of those things, one of the growing pains of it, which we need to start to address now, is building bigger teams, more teams, so that it's not just dependent on Kianga and I.
Right.
And so how do you do that? So initially we had thought that other institutions would support sending one or two of their faculty for it. We've had some trouble with that. In this economy, funding faculty to go to Africa is a stretch for a lot of institutions.
Right.
It's not always a target region. And the Global Crit Clinic isn't Africa specific in any regards, although one question that comes up for us is about sustainability. How long do we need to keep returning to a place to make sure that we didn't just swoop in, drop something, and then never return again, right? How do you make sure that there's a sustainability going on,
right?
And that you're actually providing support for it?
And then also how you kind of document this kind of formlessness that it takes. How do you...
Yeah, like you said, how do you have accountability for what happened? What did what did the participants think afterwards? How did it change things or not change things?
Right.
So we've been talking a lot about that, and I think that part of it is folding it into these kind of larger residency scenarios. So this year in Lagos, it was part of a larger residency, and it basically, the Crit Clinic formed one curricular component of the residency.
I see.
And the entire residency was based off of that seed idea of the marriage of materials and ideas.
Yes.
So that whole residency is called History Matter. And the plan for that residency is that next year it will run in Accra, the following year it will run in Dakar, and then 2014 it'll run in Maputo, Mozambique.
All right.
So that residency is specifically interested in a Pan-African network,
right?
Which is really exciting and important, and the Global Crit Clinic will definitely try to be a part of each of those.
That's right.
That entire journey, right?
Yeah.
And I think from that there's a lot of opportunity for symposium and publication to come in the future. In the meantime, we have been asked to run a clinic in Ho Chi Minh City at Sans Art in Vietnam.
Nice.
And also we're going to do a side trip. We're trying to link a few artists from Cambodia into that so that we can plant the seeds for the next clinic to be in Phnom Penh in Cambodia.
Nice. So you're already starting working with residencies in these places, so that you'll do something similar to this year's version of the Crit Clinic.
But it brings up so many questions about context, right? So, I mean
yes.
Now it goes to Southeast Asia.
Yes.
Right? So all the readings are different.
Absolutely.
The language is a different issue.
Absolutely.
Critique culture is in a different place there. Restrictions from the government, the way things can get talked about or written about. Immediately, the director, Zoe Butt of Sans Art, said we're going to have trouble with the name, Global Crit Clinic. The government, the word critique is like a red flag for the government.
Interesting.
They don't want people to gather and form critique culture.
Interesting.
So right away, but she said, she's starting this residency program for local artists, and she really wants to jumpstart it with this clinic that gets people to understand how to conduct studio visits and how to be a rigorous peer network for each other.
I think the great thing about that is that it then, I mean, you know, when you travel and you go to places with different governments, you know, have more of a, you know, socialist governments, and I think here we throw around the word critique all the time, even using in you know, oftentimes when it's not appropriate, you know, but that's because language in our society can so quickly become rhetoric, you know, but then you take that and you put it someplace else where in this context language is still very charged and still has the power to garner revolution, and just the notion of politics in language is totally different than we experience. And I think just those certain things, when you're thinking about language and you move this object into different places, informs the work when it comes back here in tremendous ways.
Yeah, because the whole way that I'm thinking about language as it relates to my own practice shifts, because now I'm thinking about it in a much more international context.
That's right.
But in an intimate way, not in this kind of like the global context way.
Or the homogenization that comes with this notion of the
globalism. Yeah.
You know, another thing that's interesting to me in talking about the Global Crit Clinic is that it finds itself in places that have ancient visual histories, visual cultures, visual languages, and a multitude of these things. And the relationship there between indigenous cultures, ancient civilizations that have visual languages that precede our visual language by centuries, but also in relation to the art world and the art market, as also being these sort of peripheral places. And I'm not saying peripheral in terms of, again, adding any type of hierarchy to the language, but that these kind of peripheral places are where you can really start to work and deal with ideas and materials and all sorts of things that you wouldn't necessarily be able to engage in a certain way if, you know, you only make in your vacuum, you know, here in New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I think things like the history of craft in East Africa. I mean, Kenya's another place that we've been in talks with Kuana Trust about running the clinic there. When you think about craft in Kenya and the history of it and what it means, it's a really different conversation than what's going on with craft here and how it's so separated out from fine arts here. And so a part of this becomes this conversation with artists about finding your field and, you know, what's the best way to navigate for your practice. And maybe that's not the art world.
Right.
Right?
It goes back to what you were saying about this everydayness, you know, just do it yourself, you know, get yourself up, get into the mix, you know, having to be creative and pay the bills at the same time. It's exact things, but also brings into the element that you haven't talked about yet, which was how the artist can start to manipulate the system and bring a certain level of awareness or malleability, or, you know, that sort of puppeteering that's involved. It's introducing that into that situation. So I'd like to hear more about that particular element, that ability of the artist to still be in the system, function in the system, but then in some way create some sort of space from it in order to know it for what it is. You know what I mean?
There's two things I want to talk about in regards to that. One is the Global Crit Clinic, but I think I'll come back to that. The other, I think, is a more direct one, which is Failure Talks, which is, I was teaching at SUNY Albany for about 3 years, and the last year that I was there, they declared like the largest humanities cuts that any state school in the country had declared. So they cut most of their language programs, their theater program, their classics program, just really across the board hatcheted their humanities program. And they got more press than they had gotten in decades, basically in a really negative way, as being, look what's happening to state education in this country, where we're basically saying that humanities is for the wealthy, and that the arts is a bourgeois activity, and it's not at the core of what our society is about, and it's not something that at a state level we're willing to support. And this has huge ramifications on those of us who are committed to being a part of the humanities, and I think on those of us who aren't committed to being a part of the humanities as well. My mother was a theater major at SUNY Albany in the 70s, and it totally changed her life. You know, I mean, I think that she didn't go on to be an actress, but it blew open how she thinks about the world. And she talks about the energy of the campus during that time and this kind of revolutionary spirit, and that came from theater. That came from those explorations that she was having. So there was this, really, when I got to campus in September that year, there was like this doom and gloom sense on campus. I mean, literally, you saw people, professors that had been there most of their careers, packing up their offices and leaving. And students that were in the last year of a program and were unsure what would happen. And it was just a really difficult time on campus, and it spread like wildfire.
That's right.
And I was working with grad students in the MFA program, and that program wasn't cut, but there were significant cuts to the program.
Oh, sure.
And it just, there was mostly just this pervasive negative kind of filter on everything. Like, nothing can happen here. This place is like, it's like gone to the wayside. And I thought it was really depressing and not productive for young artists.
That's right.
So I talked to a group of my students early on, in just like those first weeks of school, and I said, like, what are we going to do about it? Let's talk about it head on. And they said, like, we feel like the program's a failure. We feel like our school's a failure. So I said, well, let's host a series of talks around failure. Let's explore failure and what failure means.
What was the content that filled a lot of these?
So what we started to do was we started to do research and reading, and we formed like different teams. So some students were really interested in what was going on politically on campus. So they covered all the rallies, all the protests. They conducted interviews, mostly with people that were leading political rallies that were feeling like that method of protest was failing. And why was it failing? And why do we need to rethink about how we protest policy in this country? Other students were more interested in kind of everyday failure. And so those students interviewed people everywhere from the local mosque to the local retirement center to the Veterans Center, about personal failures. What as you go through your life, when you sort of reflect back, what are your failures? What comes out looking like a failure, and how is that different than what you had imagined it would be? And then we wanted to involve the arts community. And so we launched this blog where it was really a public forum to have these discussions, and we started to also interview artists. And that was where something happened for me, where I realized that, you know, you have these visiting artist programs in schools, and artists, quote, successful artists come and they show this very pretty package of, you know, 30 slides to students, and they basically say, like, I got this show, and then I got this museum show, and that led to this thing, and then I got this award, and it's like boom, 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 boom. And it looks like how did this happen?
Yes. Yeah.
And for students, particularly students who are, at a state school, not in the city, it's like the gulf between that happening for someone else and that happening for yourself seems like an ocean. So I asked artists, when I started to conduct interviews of artists that I knew, and I asked them to really focus on projects that had failed, projects that they exclude from their portfolio, moments when they had really experienced failure during an installation or an exhibition or a discussion, moments in their practice where the practice itself sort of broke down, where they doubted their core questions, where they floundered, and to really dwell in that. And some people are more receptive to that than others.
Right. Of course.
It's really tied up with ego, and it's a complicated thing to talk about your failures. And even very successful people often only want to talk about failure that directly leads to success, not failure that kind of, it's less sure what you got out of that for a very long time. Although I do believe that, like, failure it comes before success. It's like the mother of success. And that we learn from it.
Oh, for sure.
We have to sort of allow ourselves to be that vulnerable to fail. So we decided to have a symposium where we invited artists to talk about their practice in terms of failure. But we wanted it to be, we wanted to make people comfortable. We wanted it to be intimate. So we made it like a dinner party.
Okay.
We served like a really robust dinner. And we did this all with almost no funding from the department. And in fact, almost no approval from the department. It was a pretty amazing experience to see how much it kind of was like a ball that rolls and gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and takes on this life beyond Albany. And students really felt like they were part of something. But a lot of faculty was really critical of it, in that they felt like the department had enough hardship. Why were we attaching it to failure? Why were we kind of literally putting the failure flag on our roof? And that was something that was a lot of difficult conversations, because I felt like it was really, that was the only way to deal with it. Was to like head on. That was the only way to make us come out as being really innovative and using that moment.
And responsive to what's
our
going
situation.
On, because that definitely will affect the students in the program and what gets made there. There's no way to separate that one from the other. You know what I mean?
I got so much out of that. The failure talks taught me so much about my practice, about how much I'm willing to fail in the studio, but about how private I am about that. It was tremendously beneficial to me in that way. But there were consequences. I mean, I was not asked back to teach at Albany. And that's fine. I would not have done that any differently. And I'm not saying that was totally because of that, but it was an interesting experience, and I think it was an experience where you see direct cause and effect of artist agency.
And it reminds me of Bruce Nauman, early Bruce Nauman work, where he is working with photography. This has got to be maybe in the 60s, late 60s, and he has a piece called Failing to Levitate in the Studio, and he just creates this kind of superimposed image of his body laying on. I mean, it's clearly fake levitation. The illusion of it is fake. This whole idea of, again, like the illusion of art, right? And how the illusion of art kind of stifles the creative process in some way. And then also bringing in this notion of the mechanical, the technological, and then how that adds into the discourse and the cycle of creativity and studio practice and illusion and all these things. So these are ideas that I feel like at really important moments in art, not only in art but also in society and in culture, always come up, because as artists, as any person that's trained as something, you're always kind of burdened by the history or the pedagogy, as you said earlier, that comes before you. And then when you hit up against the present moment, there's that, kind of cataclysm there, because it's like, okay, the present, what's happening right now, isn't necessarily matching what the expectation or is, or what the story says is supposed to be. Like these are the moments when you come to the crossroads and you have to shift the subject, the material, the content, the form. These things have to shift in some way, but that all being a part of the progressive motion.
It's interesting because, through our interviews, through student interviews on campus with the science departments, I really realized, and it's so obvious in a way, that science embraces failure in a way that the arts doesn't. It's really built into their process.
Yep.
And they give it just as much credit, just as much validity as success within an experiment, in the lab context. And it really got me thinking about that lab metaphor and how we extend it to the studio, and how we need to observe failure just as closely as success.
Oh yeah, and then I think that opens up another conversation about this notion of observation, and just being in that process of observing. That is in itself somewhere that's the creative energy. That is the goal or the outcome in some way. So the answer is really besides the point in a lot of sense, I think. More so about this ability to formulate questions. That being more revealing than getting to that point of stasis where it's like, oh, okay, now that's complete. So now I move on to something else.
I brought in an artist, Saul Melman, to one of my classes last semester, and he's an ER doctor as well as a practicing installation and performance artist, and he talked about how being an artist makes him a better doctor because has such a keen sense of observation, that skill set is so honed that he really looks and listens first, and that he can make direct observations really astutely and intricately, and that's all from the kind of visual literacy that he's developed in his art practice.
For me, that was the education when I went to art school. I didn't get there until my master's, so my undergraduate was a completely different experience. What I got out of going to art school and being in those studio crit situations was precisely that, that ability to bring forth visual literacy. Like that was it, and that has shaped the way that I completely.
And it's increasingly more and more important in our world.
It's so important. It's so necessary.
I'm asked to look at, translate, decode, contextualize hundreds and probably thousands of images in any given day.
That's right. That's right. And not even necessarily asked to be able to decode them or to find out, if there's something to gain out of them, but to consume them. So just to take them in.
Just to figure out how I'm consuming them.
Exactly. Just
what
to take them in.
those terms are. Yeah.
So that added ability to become aware of the fact that you're even consuming images at a rate that has never been experienced before in modern human history, I think that's tremendous. And it has a tremendous effect on our minds. And just that slight thing between being a consumer and a critical thinker about images is the world of difference in terms of the type of person that you are and become.
Yeah, and how you navigate the world.
That's right. Yeah.
So there was a second example that I wanted to talk about.
Before you get to that, let me just make sure the camera's still working. Yes, it is.
and this goes back to the Global Crit Clinic. There was a woman last summer, Amuche, who has a practice that is based in a craft tradition of weaving, of basket weaving. She lives in Nsuka, which is a large city, but also has a really kind of rural complexity to its history. And she's really she's interested in a few things. One is putting women in leadership roles in West Africa. And this is a kind of side conversation that came out of the Global Crit Clinics that I think is really a growing conversation for us. And Amuche has been basically organizing these groups of women, elders in the community, along with young women, to have these basket weaving workshops where her second interest is about sanitation and trash issues in her community, and directly how that. Her husband's a surgeon, so she wants to kind of link all these disparate interests, right? So she formed these basket weaving workshops where women get together and weave trash, mostly plastics, into baskets. And then during that time, they use it as a time to kind of talk about, sort trash, think about trash, talk about trash, talk about in their domestic lives how they have control over the waste that they make, over how they reuse or repurpose it, and then where it goes after that. And then at some point this group, she has a blog going that follows their progress. At some point they started to form these sanitation protests about the lack of recycling and just general trash pickup in the city. And at some point she got awarded like the Minister of Culture Sanitation Award. So now she like has a sort of official title in the community that's her charge. But what was so interesting to me was when she came to the clinic, she showed images of baskets, and she really talked about them from a very traditional craft perspective. And it wasn't until I sat and had conversations with her that we realized that there was really all this conceptual stuff going on, and the baskets were just a sort of like output. Right. Like, in a way, it's important that they're baskets because that links them to this tradition. Absolutely. But they also, it's more about these conversations and this gathering and this kind of education movement that she's created. So I started to introduce her to a lot of the social practice artists, and particularly to the research that I've been doing with Ted Purvis for this new book, which is a second edition of What We Want Is Free, but it's focused more on structures of exchange. And what I mean by that is these projects that don't necessarily need to be called art projects. Right. Like, I keep asking the question of what do they gain or lose by being called an artwork. And so what have you assessed in asking that question? That a lot of them just ignore it and don't need it. And I think Amuche, I really tried to like arm her with a lot of people that are working on projects in a similar vein, to show her how she could start to contextualize this. And this was like really blew things out of the water for her. She started this blog called Talking Trash, and and she's like really, she's got a lot of momentum, and she and I write back and forth, and it's really like she has been writing in her local paper these really critical essays that are super great. And I don't think, I think she says like, I'm not sure that I'm an artist, and I keep sort of writing back to her and saying like, I don't know if it matters. Right. You know, at some point, you just have to figure out what matters, what's core to the project. And if people keep saying to you, well, that's not art, does that matter at a certain point? Like, just again, this goes back to let's manipulate things. You know, just use the skill sets that you have as an artist to put this into the fields that you want it to go into.
Right.
And if that's the public health sector,
right,
then if that's the way you're going to reach the most people with this work, then that's the way it should go.
Right. Because I'm thinking that the hesitation about calling it an art project is that it then becomes very limiting in terms of its impact, or at least the way people will perceive its impact on a more broader social scale.
Yeah, and she says, like, well, it becomes more about the baskets and less about the conversation.
Right. It becomes more
people
about the
want to
object.
buy the baskets.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's fine, but that's not really what she wants to talk about.
Right. Right.
So it's like, how do you get the conversation to come back to what you want it to be about?
Yeah.
And I think that's really, like, it's so interesting to me. And she brought up so many problematics to me, like how, you know, as a woman in West Africa, you have kids, you're usually the primary caretaker. So things like the Global Crit Clinic are really difficult. So how do we address, like, that into the form?
Right.
How does that flexibility get built
Right.
in? And one thing that we've been talking about in terms of, like, what's next and what would we do with our first grant, is that the Global Crit Clinic, really to become this, like, peer network that we want it to be, needs to have a website that's really interactive, where participants can constantly upload their own images, can edit each other's text. So you could upload, like, your artist statement or a project proposal for a certain grant, and then you could have peers edit it, and they wouldn't even need to be peers in that same city. And that also things could get translated, that, you know, through Bing or one of these translation services, that you could really speak or write in the language that is most comfortable to you, and then you could get help translating it into the language that you need for your grant or for your project proposal. Because language is also hugely complicated in a lot of places, right?
Absolutely.
And so I think that, like, creating an infrastructure for the web, and really, I think, developing a kind of mentorship for the Global Crit Clinic, of maybe an informal advisory board, to sort of help us workshop through, you know, how to launch open source, an open source site where people can add in, how to make that functional when you're in an area with low bandwidth, what aspects of the curriculum can be broadcast for everyone, and what aspects need to be specific for locale, and how can we build that sensitivity in?
Right.
That I really feel like is the next step, because that's what holds the clinics together in the interim months.
Absolutely. That's like the online time is the time when you're not in residence or, you know, at the site. I totally can see the necessity for having still that additional space to continue
and it makes the conversation less dependent on a certain upward mobility of each participant.
That's right. The physicality of getting to a place. Yeah.
Of having childcare, of saying I have these 2 weeks. It's okay. Actually, I'm still able to be part of this conversation.
That's right. Yeah.
In this network and get feedback.
The web is also a really important part of this process as well, because as I'm thinking about the ideas of social engagement, which I would love for us to talk about, that I'm also thinking as a part of that, this notion of sharing that is inherent in the language on the web. You know, when you're adding information to the web through any site now, so many sites are about user-generated content and about this notion of sharing content. So there's not just one author, there's this constant sort of multiplicity and multivocality of people and ideas and things all the time in the space. And so for me, what I've gleaned from that is this notion of generosity, right? So I'm thinking about sharing as this form of generosity, and that within social engagement, for me in particular, I'm really interested in how projects or ideas or people come together in a creative way of some kind through this notion of generosity, and really want to use the web as a means to be emblematic of how those things happen, right? So just in thinking about the projects that you've talked about and the ways in which you've taught and have engaged with your students and also other artists, and also, in any realm of your life, how generosity has come about in that, and if you even consider that to be a seed by which something like social engagement has to have in order to be able to function.
I worked on Ted's first book with him, and the subtext of that, of what we want is free, was generosity. It was about generosity. And I spent a lot of time being really critical of that term.
How so?
And of thinking about, does it always enter you into a kind of coded exchange where there's an expectation? And is it to some extent a Western idea that replicates what I would call like a sort of missionary approach? I mean, Kianga and I have been grappling with calling the Global Crit Clinic a service project for the same reasons, because I keep going, well, a service project, it's like reeks of this kind of missionary attitude, but she keeps saying, and she's right, but it is a service project. Like, it is about
missionary.
Like going there and like being on the ground and putting in like 10 grueling days where you just sort of like try to give as much as you can.
Right.
And that's true. It's really true.
Right.
But I think what I struggle with, it's maybe just the terminology, not the impulse of it.
Right.
And it's because I think ultimately, when you're generous, you get so much back in return that it's like, it's hard for me to dwell on the part of it that's the outgoing part.
Right.
Because I come back from the Global Crit Clinic or from the Failure Talks thing going, wow, I learned so much about myself.
Right. So, so here's the thing then, right? See, the way that I come at something like generosity, or again, this idea of sharing, I'm somewhat using these terms interchangeably. I think in order to share, you have to be coming from a position of generousness in order to do something like that. So the generosity is kind of the what precedes the sharing. But it functions for me on a plane that is much older than, say, our ideas of exchange, for instance, in terms of the way we're used to thinking about economy. Because I think once you then start to throw in terms like sharing and generosity, you then also start to talk about other economic systems. And then when you start to talk about other economic systems, and you start to talk about other forms of valuation. So where do you then put the value of things if it's not necessarily about exchange in terms of monetary currency? That's what we're so used to thinking in terms of when we think about exchange. It undercuts that kind of idea. It's this notion of altruism that I feel like people are very skeptical about. You know, it's like, can you really give without the anticipation of something else coming? I think that you can. I think that we do it all the time. We always give without the anticipation of something else coming. And every time we give, we also receive something, whether or not we choose to consciously or unconsciously accept it, right? Which is another element to it altogether. And then that's also where I start to differentiate, or at least attempt to differentiate between social engagement and social practice. Because for me, social practice is where the word service comes in. Like, I'm practicing, and in my social practice, I tend to think about that practice in relation to a service. Whereas engagement kind of takes, you don't necessarily have to be like in service in any way. You can just kind of be engaged in some way, whether that be like playing dominoes in the park, you know, with the guys that play dominoes, or taking portraits of people around anywhere. You know, you can kind of figure out how you want to engage with people, places, or things, you know. And I think that now that so much of this language is cropped up, now there's so much of this like social practice or social engagement, and there's so much slippage between the terms. Is it even necessary to make these kinds of distinctions? Are these distinctions somehow besides the point, or do particular things come up in making the distinctions? For instance, the notion of moralism, and does art have to serve some sort of good? You know, why does that need to be a part of the conversation? A good or a bad thing?
I mean, I think those terms get really slippery.
Yeah.
And I do think that where they come back to haunt us is when things then funnel back into the individual artist. Because social engagement and some kind of like individual genius, those things don't seem like they're on the same page.
Right.
To me.
Right.
So there's something at odds there. And like, I think about sharing as being based on kind of mutually beneficial exchange and trust. And trust is something that I think is really important to me. And I think it is somehow linked to generosity. Because I think like developing intimacy with someone where there's a safe space to have a critical conversation is totally key. It's paramount to having a conversation.
Oh yeah.
And it's also one of the more difficult things to do.
Yeah. We're definitely dependent, this conversation is dependent on the trust that we have invested in each other. I mean, it's like we have the privilege of having known each other before this conversation. But even still, even, you know, setting up this kind of triad position of us and allowing then this third party of the camera, which will then allow an infinite number of viewers to be a part of the conversation. You know,
I think about like a lot of what I do in the studio with really everyday materials. I think about as being like these materials that have a embedded and applied histories contained within them through their social life, and that I then sort of cobble together to make into these talisman objects that have a sort of magic or like a juju that I think about them as being charms or wishes. And I want like materials, for me, really the interaction between materials really mimic human relationships, and they help me understand them. So like there's about the studio practice as being less or more socially engaged as the conversation practice.
right.
I think about it as being the kind of part of me that's introverted and processes things through these material metaphors, and then the part of me that's extroverted and processes these things out loud through conversation and direct contact. And I don't think that I as a person can do one without the other.
Right.
Because there's this thing of like, you always, at the end of the day, you're always there. So you have to sort of deal with your own terms for the conversation before you try and pull other people into it.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like a human experience. It's so far beyond just the experience of the artist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But like the work of all of us, like the work that all of us need to be doing on a regular basis by whatever means necessary.
But I think that with the artist, there is this like the myth of the artist as this loner, as this like solitary figure in the studio. That myth is so built up that it's almost like elevated to a level that I think is unhealthy. And then on the flip side, a lot of people in the world spend almost no time alone.
Right.
And that is built up into this myth that's equally as unhealthy, right?
Oh, it's totally dysfunctional.
This fear of solitude.
Right.
So I think both are in these extremes.
Yes.
And a lot of these new hybrid practices, socially engaged practices, I think are trying to bridge those. And I think we're in a really experimental phase with that stuff.
Oh, for sure.
I don't always think it needs to be art. And I always come back to that, especially in my research for the book. I really push to include a section of the art. We have a section of the book as an artist resource handbook, and it's a compilation of artist projects. And we put together a panel of peers that we solicit projects from. And most people give us straight art projects, and this year I really made a push for these projects that fall under exchange structures. And they don't necessarily need to be art projects.
Right. Right.
And it got us into this really slippery terrain of, well, what's the limit? Is Facebook one? Is Kickstarter? And so I'm writing about those things because I think those things are shaping these projects. But I also think we have to the book has to have parameters. Everything, in order to be rigorous, has to have limits. It has to draw some lines and say, here's the criteria.
Right. Well, especially if you want there to be a level of understanding, for lack of a better term. You know, you have to kind of create parameters for comprehension to a certain degree. You know?
Definitely.
But you said something that I thought was really smart, and I think is perhaps the crux, or at least one of the cruxes of this process, and that is this idea that the notion of sharing or generosity undercuts or subverts the idea of the individual artist. Because I think that a part of this is this moving away from these notions of individuality. And again, I think that spills into not only from the artist's perspective, but also from the notion of granting, you know, how granting structures have been thus far, you know, about a very individualistic thing, and curatorial work also, you know, still somehow, and I'm thinking about individualism in terms of another word you brought up, the ego, you know, this kind of sense, this misperception of self that we all create for our bodies in order to kind of move around in the world, or to at least professionalize ourselves, you know, and say that we work in a particular profession, right? So I'm thinking that is something that I'm going to definitely keep, you know, I'm going to pull that idea to the forefront of this, because I also think then that this subversion of individuality also plays into rethinking economics too, and then again, valuation. Where then is the value?
Yeah.
And how do you assess? So it completely like throws open the entire way that we've been working up to this point. And
our country's history is we're so wrapped up in individualism.
Absolutely.
That it's
Capitalism.
really hard for us to not constantly fall back to it.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
We want to sort of say, look at this great story of this person that made it from here to here, all by themselves, the self-made man. I mean, that's like one of the biggest myths in American history. And
it's definitely found its limit this day and age with where we find ourselves now, politically, economically.
But we still have trouble accepting help, accepting a real, like, collaboration, like real collaboration it's really difficult. I ran a seminar this spring at Parsons on collaborative production models, and I made the students run through a lot of different ways of working with other people, from a kind of straight fabrication relationship to a collective, forming collectives, to alter egos, pen pals, and it was really interesting how every single person said, this is so hard, and I learned so much about my own crap.
Yes. Well, there's that constant kind of mirroring that goes on, you know, whenever you are placed in front of another pair of eyes, right? But then that's also, again, about how much we've come to define ourselves based on another set of eyes.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's always like, you know, that constant challenging. It's like, but not necessarily freeing.
But the reality
but
is
building
so
more
many,
ego.
I mean, so many artists are working these days on a production model where it's much more of that film model, where there's a large crew of people that are making work happen.
Yes.
But the art world still won't even list any of those people on the wall text. I mean, it's just like this
one.
It's so, you know, I produce photo shoots, and in the photo world, you know, you're always credited as the producer. When I produce photo shoots in the fine art world, it just goes without saying that you will get your paycheck, but you will never, it will be like you never existed and you never did any work and you will never speak of it again.
Yes.
And that's totally just like, that's the way it is.
That's the way that it is.
Because one person's name will be on this thing. It's really interesting to me,
it's
you know?
the failing to levitate in the studio.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like that constant, you trying to rise, and then there's that pressure that's like, nope, we can only understand it.
What if
this
the
way.
world knows that it took a village to make this image, you know?
Right. But, you know, I think that through the creative process, one of the reasons why the creative process is so dangerous to the status quo is because it will call to light the way that things come about in our visual realities. You know, it will uncover that illusion of that one person. You know, that the mythology of the self-made man or woman. It just would have to, and it would just necessitate a complete, you know, unveiling of the wizard behind the, you know what I mean, like the Wizard of Oz thing, and you know, it will shrink that one person down to like this like little person that's pulling all the levers and the wheels.
But the art market hasn't yet allowed it to happen at all.
But not only the art market, I think there are many markets that won't allow that to happen. It happens even in our political structure. You know, the president is the grand guy, but there's so much going on before the president even steps in front of the podium. There's been a plethora of editing, of vetting, of, you know, what he says he never wrote, somebody else wrote that. You know what I mean? But that's the way that I think the illusion of our visual culture works. And so you have to kind of perpetuate this idea of this one entity so that people will understand, first of all, authority. you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's about a stage.
Yeah.
A stage presence.
For sure.
Yeah.
And then so when you start to think about all of that as performative, then that undermines the entire thing. You know, it's like, okay, this is performance, like this is not real. Then you start getting into questions of reality, and then that's just too far gone in terms of where we as citizens should be allowed to think.
Yeah.
Right? Which is why programs at the state level in the humanities get cut left and right. It's like, sure, we can get rid of all the creative fields because who needs creative, imaginative thinkers?
Because we're struggling with how we assess value in those fields.
Absolutely. You know, and also still want to be able to control the mind. And so, to me, so much about it is that kind of paranoia of losing the control of people's minds. So if we just get them, just about, science, math, they will be formula solvers, just like researching particular things. We don't have to have these, artists, scientists, and all this crazy shit that's going on with, this ER doctor that's also an artist. That's crazy. It's just ridiculous. This should never happen. How does that happen? It's like not how it's supposed to be.
But that's what I meant to go back to our initial sentence, like forming, that I'm interested in people who form a creative path.
Oh yeah.
And whether they call themselves artists or not, like I want to be engaged and accountable to people who are doing that in their lives, in their everyday lives.
To me, it's about freedom. To me, that's freedom. To be able to carve your creative path, it's freedom that's at stake. And although I feel like freedom has been so co-opted and, just kind of being this ideology that, before it was co-opted in the ideology, like people struggle quite tangibly, for their freedom. And to really carve out the life that you want through all this excess stuff, So, that's my rant. We can end it there.
Okay.
You want?
Okay.
Is that good?
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, unless you're...
or if you have something else you want to...
No, I think we talked a lot.
I think we did too, and I wonder about the future of my fellowship.